One of the things that keeps students from progressing in their essays or getting their essay written, at least for the first draft, can be the introduction. If you are struggling with the introduction, I would suggest starting later in the essay. Just start with the body and come back and put on an introduction. However, we don't want to have that philosophy type of introduction where we start out with something like in today's society and we just pontificate about the world in general. Instead, we're going to look at how to create an introduction for an argument essay. The purpose of an introduction, really what we're looking to do is to provide some context for your essay. You might want to talk about what the problem is that you're going to be discussing. You might want to give some factual information. For example, if you're talking about a topic like secondhand smoke, you might want to define what that is. You might want to talk about why that's an issue. You might want to talk about some of the problems that it can create. And so what we're doing is we're justifying our topic. We're giving some type of context or some type of background that helps justify that topic. Now, in doing this, you don't want to mention the assignment itself. You don't want to say something like, when I was given this assignment, I mulled over a bunch of topics before landing on whatever it is. We don't want to mention the assignment because our audience is likely not going to be in this class. And so you want to write to that audience. So don't mention the assignment. And in the thesis, don't say, in this essay, we want to create some type of objective distance from ourselves and our topic. The introduction, we do want to make sure it's objective. And what that means is it's factual. We don't want to make any claims prior to the thesis because then it can be confusing as to what the thesis actually is. So we want to be objective and factual throughout until we get to that last sentence of the introduction, which will be our major claim in the thesis. I mentioned philosophy. We can look at something like this that starts with in today's society. We see some things that are going to indicate philosophy. For example, the word we. When we're talking about we, we're talking about people as a whole in the world, or we're talking about people in general as far as maybe in the United States. We're not getting anything specific towards the topic. And so we want to avoid these philosophical introductions. Now, I have been guilty myself of writing them. So one thing that I will sometimes do is I'll look at my second paragraph, which is usually the one that contains that background or context, and I'll just remove the first paragraph and start with the second one. I think I even mentioned this in a couple of your essays for essay 2, is to remove this philosophy introduction and just start with the background that you give. I will allow you to just pause on these and in future introductions that I show, I'll let you pause on them and read them on your own. I'm not going to read them word for word in this video. So there are 4 ways that we can engage the reader. We think of the term hook. I don't really like that term because students feel like they need to really grab the reader, and so they'll use something like an exclamation point. We don't want to do that for the hook. All we want to do is engage the reader using one of these 4 methods. Let's go ahead and look at those 4 ways to engage the reader. We can start with an anecdote or a short personal story. We can use a quote and the explanation. We can start with a question, or we can start with a fact or figure and explanation. If you use one of these 4 ways to engage the reader, that's all that I'm looking for. Okay, so this will be your hook. So let's look at these in detail. The first, to relate an anecdote. So you can introduce your essay with a brief story. These are usually personal stories. Again, you don't want to give a story about receiving the assignment or anything to do with the assignment. But if we're looking at a topic like secondhand smoke, you could talk about a time you walked out of a bank and an employee was smoking right outside the doors, and you walked through that smoke. So just something simple. It's usually a minute or a couple minutes of a story. Okay, so that's a nice way to introduce because it gives kind of this personal relationship with the reader. The story should, however, build context for the thesis. You don't want to give a story about maybe hunting or fishing or something if you're going to talk about secondhand smoke, unless it relates to the actual topic that you've chosen. You don't want to force an anecdote. So again, don't include a story that doesn't work just because you like the story. Okay, we're not going to try to force something in there that doesn't work. Here is an example of an anecdote for an argument paper. This person is arguing against allowing kids to play football, especially in junior high or high school type situations. Again, I'll let you read through this and see how that story works to set up the essay. Philosophy can come up in anecdotes. We think of something like this. They're starting by talking about something that actually happened, asking a little girl who her hero was, but then it really gets into that philosophy where they're talking about heroes in general. Some of you might have done this in your second essay. But we want to remove all that philosophy from that introduction. It should be objective. We shouldn't have any claims prior to your thesis. So begin with a quote and explanation. These can help show that you're focused on experts and what the experts are saying. You want to find a quote that you really like, that's pleasing, and a quote that comes from your research. You don't want to go onto Google and just search for quotes. The problem with this is we end up getting quotes out of context. Sometimes they're attributed to the wrong person. So it's much better to take a quote from your articles that you found. We must explain our quotes so that our reader doesn't interpret a different way than what we meant it to be interpreted. So we want to offer that explanation as well. And we want to make sure that, again, the quote provides context for that thesis. Should be within the same topic. Here is an example. Again, you can pause this. You can read through this example and see how they're using a quote to begin this essay. We can use an interesting fact or figure. So if you find a statistic you really like, or you find a fact that you think not many people will know, we can start that way and then lead into the essay. We can think of dates, names, places, statistics, anything that will help add kind of a real world avenue into your essay. Okay, so it helps by staying objective, again, sticking with factual information. And then just like with a quote, we need to make sure it's in context with your thesis, need to make sure it's relevant, and we need to make sure that we are explaining that statistic or that fact. Okay, so here is an example of a fact or figure about how much the United States contributes for charitable causes. You can go ahead and pause and look through this one also. Then we get to that revealing question. This works best when the question is maybe something surprising or something that the reader hasn't thought to ask. Questions are probably the most common tactic I see in student essays, and yet it is the most difficult, and it's the one that I comment the most on, saying this question isn't working. One of the reasons is we need to make sure that the question is open-ended. That means it's not easily answered. And you can see the problem with a closed-ended question. For example, if I said, do you think it's okay to spank a child who's misbehaving? If you say yes, and I'm arguing no, it's not, now we get this adversarial relationship between each other. And you're going to be looking for every flaw within my essay. Because if we ask the reader a question and they answer, they don't want to feel that they're wrong. And so we don't want to set up that opposition between us and our reader. So instead, it should be open question, and it should, again, reveal what the essay is about. Everything should have context for the essay. The question shouldn't be something easily answered. This is that close-ended question. For example, I might ask, what is a bug? I believe an insect has 6 legs. What a bug is, I'm not quite sure. So that maybe will get the reader thinking before we actually get into the essay. Here is an example of a revealing question. What is the proper way to react when seeing a child being spanked by a parent, also known as corporal punishment? So if you see this, what's the right way to react? That's more open-ended, and that's going to get you thinking about that topic before we actually get into the essay. Now, with all of these, you again want to build that context or provide that background. So this is just a way to grab the reader's attention prior to getting into the background or the context of your introduction. I would suggest going through these 4 methods. Again, if you write your essay first, it's nice because you can then look at these 4 methods of introducing your topic and figure out which one's going to work the best for you. If you have a quote that you really like, maybe use that to begin. If you can think of the perfect story, maybe start there. Whatever method you use, you still want to build that background and context, but maybe see which of these 4 is going to be the best for your essay. Now, you may have noticed that in some of those introductions, they're using a combination, and that is totally fine. You just want to make sure that your introduction is about 10% of the essay. So if the essay is 1,400 words, your introduction should be about 140 words. We don't want to let the introduction or conclusion take over the essay. So both should be about 10%.